Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome back, clinicians and techies, to today's Explainer. We're taking a really close look at a wildly fascinating piece of medical and technical architecture, Dr. Avinash Kumar Gupta's June 2026 Vi-Brown's framework. Specifically, we're zeroing in on Lesson 8, which is all about evidence and calibration. Look, whether you're, writing code for massive healthcare systems or you're actually on the ward making life-saving decisions, this curriculum, it's an absolute masterclass in breaking down exactly how we think.
But before we totally dissect the nuts and bolts of Lesson 8, we really have to wrap our heads around the core mission of this dual-track course. The whole goal here is taking the invisible, kind of impenetrable black box of clinical reasoning and making it completely visible. We aren't just caring about the final diagnosis that ends up on a chart. No, we're looking at the actual motion of the mind. Like, how does a clinician get from a messy jumble of raw lab results, vague symptoms, and a patient's history to a concrete rock-solid judgment? That journey, that whole process, is what we call clinical cognition.
So here's our Socratic journey for this explainer. First, the clinical cognition engine. Second, the single score trap. Third, multi-domain reporting. Fourth, the shadow review. And finally, number 5, true clinical calibration. Let's get into it.
Starting with Section 1, the clinical cognition engine.
To really appreciate the mechanics of evidence and calibration, we gotta realize that Lesson 8 doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It sits perfectly inside this broader, incredibly detailed 13-lesson curriculum that's built entirely around a cognitive core loop. Think about it like a progression. We start with observation back in Lesson 1, we move on to differential building in Lesson 3, we lock down system safety in Lesson 7, and then, boom, we arrive at our focus for today, Lesson 8, calibration. This sequence is literally by design. Calibration is that absolutely crucial final refinement step. It's basically the last check of your cognitive instruments before you ever attempt a full start-to-finish case run in Lesson 9.
Moving on to Section 2, the single score trap.
We need to shift our focus to what is arguably the biggest danger in clinical tech development and, frankly, everyday medical practice today, and that's oversimplification. I mean, in our rush to make data super digestible, we often strip away the exact context that makes it useful in the first place. Just imagine looking at a patient's diagnostic chart, or maybe a dashboard in some shiny new piece of clinical software, and you just see this giant arbitrary confidence percentage, 85%. I mean, it looks definitive, doesn't it? It feels like actionable data. But is it really?
Now, what's really interesting is that this number actually exposes a massive fatal flaw. Relying on one monolithic scalar score, it's a total trap. Think about it. If an AI or a colleague tells you they are 85% confident, what exactly are they confident in? Are they 85% sure the patient's self-reported history is accurate? Are they 85% confident in the lab assay's sensitivity? Or are they saying they're 85% sure of the final diagnosis, assuming perfectly accurate data? Compressing all of those totally distinct variables into a single number creates a very, very dangerous illusion of certainty.
Which brings us to Section 3, multi-domain confidence reporting.
So the first principle solution to this exact problem is pretty straightforward, but revolutionary. We absolutely have to abandon the old, flawed method of leaning on a single, heavy scalar score that just hides its own weaknesses. It just doesn't work. Instead, Lesson 8 teaches the Vi-Brown's method, which is all about fracturing our reasoning into several independent judgments. We assess the quality of the evidence separately from the weight of the conclusion. It's about treating medical reasoning with the structural respect it actually deserves.
Think about it this way. Instead of one big, clunky number, a diagnostic decision gets sliced into multiple independent domains. Let's say, for example, you suspect a patient has pneumonia. Okay, well, you might have one high-confidence domain for the chest x-ray, maybe a moderate confidence domain for the patient's timeline of a cough, and then a third, totally separate domain assessing how well those physiological dots actually connect. To build and practice safe clinical cognition, you have got to measure every single one of these independently.
Let's jump to Section 4, the shadow review process. Let's move along and see how this builds, because you might be wondering, how is this multi-domain reporting actually vetted in the real world? Well, it relies on specific modules from the Vi-Brown's prompt library, namely modules 21, 35, and the combination of 45 and 46. Step 1 is generating that multi-domain report we just talked about. But Step 2? Step 2 is the absolute secret weapon, the shadow review. The report gets evaluated independently, kind of in the shadows, by a reviewer who was totally blind to the original clinician's ultimate conclusion. Literally, they have no idea what the first person decided. And only after passing this rigorous blind stress test do we finally reach Step 3, finalized calibration. It ensures the reasoning isn't just some post hoc justification for a lucky guess.
And finally, Section 5, Achieving True Clinical Calibration.
Let's zoom out for a second. How does all of this compare with its sibling discipline, evidence-based medicine, or EBM? Well, really, they're two sides of the same coin. EBM is out there asking, can I trust this study? Is the research rigorous? But clinical cognition asks a totally different question. How did I get from those raw findings to a judgment in the first place? As the course notes, these two frameworks are completely complementary. They're not sequential. You absolutely need both. Because honestly, excellent evidence applied with sloppy cognitive reasoning is just as dangerous as perfect reasoning based on terrible evidence.
So, the crucial point is summarized perfectly by a foundational rule from Vibrowns. Whether you're using a wildly complex AI diagnostic tool or a highly structured cognitive framework like the one we've just unpacked together, this system enhances human verification. It never, ever replaces it. The whole machinery of Lesson 8 is designed to make your reasoning transparent so it can be verified, not so it can just go off and act autonomously without any oversight.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, tracing the path from the deep flaws of single-score thinking all the way to the rigor of multi-domain shadow reviews. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought to carry into your next shift or, hey, your next coding sprint. If a single scalar score can't capture true confidence, how will you audit your own cognitive biases tomorrow? How are you going to break down your next big decision into its actual independent judgments? Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with me. Keep asking the hard questions and keep making me invisible visible.